I had a particular client that had called multiple lawyers that nobody would take his case. And he was actually shot 3 times in the stomach. And so I'm going to tell you his story and how ultimately we were able to hold his apartment complex responsible so that they took care of his medical bills. Hi, my name is Michael Coker. I'm a personal injury lawyer in Lawrenceville, and today I'm going to tell you the story about how I got justice for one of my clients. He was this young gentleman who was a young man, hard worker, and an immigrant, had come from another country. And one night he was at his apartment complex and he decided to step out onto the balcony to talk to his girlfriend on the phone, just like most teenagers do. And so he stepped out on the balcony, he calls his girlfriend, and he's talking to her. And almost immediately, an individual runs up and puts a gun to his stomach. And the individual screams at him to give his wallet over to the criminal. Now, unfortunately, my client, English was his second language. And so he had a very difficult time understanding what that criminal was saying. But he had a gun pressed into his stomach. And so he panicked and didn't know what to do. Well, ultimately, the criminal who was committing the robbery got tired of waiting on him and ultimately shot him 3 times in the abdomen. One of the bullets was so bad that it got lodged into his pelvis and could ultimately not be removed. Well, that client was obviously someone else called 911. An ambulance arrived and rushed him to the hospital. He spent over 2 months in a coma dealing with the ramifications of his injury. Entire sections of his intestine had to be removed by the surgeons because it took so much damage from the bullets. Ultimately, they didn't think he was going to survive, and they thought that his life would basically never be the same again. But over time, he stayed in the hospital for a period of months. He improved, but he always was left with that bullet lodged in his pelvis, because the reality was is that bullet was too close to his nerve and too close to his arteries, that it just could not be taken out surgically. And so he was going to have to live with that bullet inside of him for the rest of his life. Well, he felt that his apartment complex did not do enough to protect him and the other residents from acts of crime just like this. In fact, they had a gate at this particular apartment complex that had not been fixed for years. And so criminals were authorized to come and go whenever they wanted to without any ability to stop their access or stop them from coming on the property. And so these groups of individuals would come in and would prey on these people who lived at this low-income apartment complex until ultimately this incident happened. And so he called multiple lawyers and said, "Hey, will you help me?" And lawyer after lawyer told him, no, there's no case there. We can't do anything. Sorry, we can't help you. Until he called our firm. And I remember the first day I spoke with him, him and his family, he called and he told me what happened. And obviously I felt terrible for what he had been through. But I promised to look into it. I couldn't make him any promises as to whether or not there was a case. But I told him that our team would do what we could to uncover the truth, to at least give him some sense of closure of what happened and what was going on at the apartment complex. So my team started our investigation, and it started with the county. And the first thing we did is we sent an open records request for every call for service at that particular apartment complex. Now, calls for service are basically a log that's at the police department for every time the police are called out for an incident. And it tells you when they were called, the time they were called, and what the issue was when they arrived. And based on that call for service, we found out that in a 2-year period, there had been over 35 armed robberies at that apartment complex. So immediately we knew something was wrong. Something was off, and this needed to be looked in any further. So we reached out to the apartment complex and we told them, "Hey, we need you to turn over your information to us about what you knew, what was happening here, and whether or not you guys had adequate security in place." Well, of course, red flags went up for us when we realized that the apartment complex specifically told us, "No, we're not going to turn any of that over to you unless you file a lawsuit." So my team called our client and said, "Listen, we're going to file that lawsuit, and we're going to do what we need to do to get this information for you." Again, we had no idea if we could win this case. If we could prove that that apartment complex had actually not taken action, had not done what they were supposed to protect these residents, but we were willing to invest the money, we were willing to look into it when no other lawyer or law firm would. So we filed the lawsuit, and we come to find out various aspects that it wasn't just the gate that was the problem. It was other employees at the complex had known about this, had known the dangers that these particular individuals were in at the complex, but had done nothing about it. We also found out that the complex had had security guards that had walked the property all night, every single night. But ultimately, the owner of the apartment complex felt like they were spending too much money on security. And so ultimately, they decided to cut that from the budget. And so they wanted to increase their profit line by cutting out the security from the particular budget. And so this was a very interesting and important development in the case, because when we found out that that apartment complex had cut off the security, had not fixed the gate, despite knowing that all this was going on the property, we knew that this actually might be a case, and we might actually be able to help this young man. And so we did what's called a site inspection. It's a legal inspection where we're allowed to go to the apartment complex, take pictures, take measurements, and we took an expert with us. And the expert was actually head of security at one point for the Atlanta Hawks. And so this is somebody who has vast knowledge and vast experience about security and making sure people are safe, especially in large crowds or in groups of people. And so we took him with us, and he took pictures, he took measurements, and he found out that not only was the gate broken, but a section of the fence had been entirely cut so that these criminals could come and go whenever they pleased. And so we immediately then turned back to the apartment complex and we said, hey, did they know that that gate had been cut, or that that section of the fence had been completely removed, allowing these criminals to access the apartment complex? And so we did more discovery, we took more statements, more depositions, and we asked that question. And come to find out, we learned from one of the heads of the apartment complex that they also knew that that fence had been cut, and yet they again made a decision to maximize the profit and not fix the individual fence. And so having learned this, now we had multiple things showing that this apartment complex had not taken action, that they had removed the security guards, they had not fixed the fence, they had not fixed the gate. And so they changed their defense. And their new defense was, well, we did not know that this apartment complex was dangerous. We didn't know about the danger. We didn't know this was an issue. And so even though we did those things, we had no knowledge that this was going on. And so we had to involve the county, and we had to depose police officers, and we had to talk about the officers that returned to this complex over and over and over again, because we needed to show to win the case that the apartment complex knew that this complex was dangerous and that they didn't take action. So we knew they didn't take action, but we had to still prove that they knew that it was dangerous. And through depositions, through statements, we found out that the apartment complex was given a copy of every single police report for every single incident inside that complex. They kept it in a file. They kept it in a drawer. Of course, they didn't tell us that. They didn't disclose that to us. They didn't give us a copy of those incident reports when we asked for them. But come to find out from the police department, those were provided as a service for every single incident in that apartment complex. Well, once that was found out, once we took depositions of those police officers, and they ultimately determined that, yes, this complex did have knowledge, they did understand the danger, and yet they, again, failed to protect the low-income people who live there, then we knew we had a case. And so now it was time to talk about our client's injuries and about what he had been through and the various issues that he had faced. And so that's when we started talking to medical doctors. We started talking to individuals who understood what this young man would face, having this bullet lodged in his pelvis for the rest of his life. And so We took the time to interview his doctors, his surgeons, the people at the hospital, and we learned that this young man would have nerve pain basically in his leg every day for the rest of his life. Now, at the time of the incident, he was like 18 or 19 years old. And so, from that age of 18 or 19 years old until he died, until the date he died, that he would have this continued nerve pain, and there was absolutely nothing that they could do about it. They couldn't fix it, they couldn't lessen his pain, and that obviously being a young man, he had to keep working. He had to keep, providing for the family. He had to keep taking care of himself. And so he went from being one of the head individuals at a construction site to basically being the person who would clean up after everybody else left, because he was no longer able to climb ladders. He was no longer able to lift heavy things. And so he was now the lowest paid person at the construction site, who would basically go around and pick up the remaining construction items that were discarded or thrown on the ground. And that was his responsibility. So not only did he lose his health, but he completely lost his career and everything that went along with it. And, he was not the type of individual who just decided not to work or said, hey, I'm not gonna, I'm just gonna stay at home and do nothing all day. He wanted to work. He wanted to be out there. And so he took the lowest paying job, which was the easiest for him because he could do a sweep and do a cleanup. And then he could go take a quick rest, let his nerve pain in his legs subside, and then he would continue again. Then he would go and do another round of cleanup and then let the nerve pain subside. And this went on and on and on. And so we talked to him. We talked about the people he worked with. We talked to his loved ones, his family, about what was going on and how this had affected him. And now the apartment complex through the entire thing was telling us, we're not going to settle with you. No way. We'll see you in court. There's no way that a judge or a jury is going to hold us responsible. There's no way that we're going to proceed. And so they filed what's called a motion for summary judgment. And a motion for summary judgment is basically when the defendant asks the judge, hey, judge, we want you to throw this case out of court. We want you to not allow a jury to hear this because we do not believe that the plaintiff or my client has enough evidence to prove that we win. And so we researched and spent days and hours after hours after hours doing research and drafting briefs in response to this motion for summary judgment to argue that no, our client does have enough evidence. Look at what happened. Look at what they knew from the police department. Look at what they failed to do, and look at what he's been through and his damages. Well, ultimately, in that particular case, the judge ruled and said, yes, you're right. I agree with the plaintiff. There is enough evidence. There is enough evidence of his damages. There is problems with this apartment complex. And again, this was a case that no other lawyer would take. No other lawyer would even talk to this individual or look into the case. But because our firm was able to do the investigation, talk to the police department, do the research that needed to be done, we were able to acquire justice for him. And so ultimately, we decided once we won that summary judgment, once we knew we were going to court, the apartment complex realized that they were going to lose this case, that this was not going to be a case they were going to win, that my client was very sympathetic, and that a jury was going to be very interested in helping him and compensating him for what he went through. And so ultimately, they decided to settle the case for $2.1 million to compensate him for what he went through. And so that was something that, again, for this individual, that was life-changing money. It was his ability to go forward and to be able to realize that he could pay his future medical bills, that he could do the various things that he needed to do to make sure that he was taken care of in the future. And so that's one of those stories that I'm most proud of as a lawyer, because we had this individual who went through this horrific thing that should have never happened if the apartment complex had just done what they were supposed to do. And then ultimately, he went to lawyer after lawyer after lawyer who told him, no, sorry, you're just going to have to live with it. But our firm, having the team in place, having the willingness to put in the work, we were there, we fought for him, and ultimately we got him this great result. And so that's one of those cases that I would say I'm most proud of in my career. Sometimes my favorite cases are not always the biggest ones, but sometimes they're the ones where we fought and fought for someone when no one else would. And it's moments like that that make me proud to be a lawyer, that make me proud of what I do in this personal injury space, because we all know personal injury lawyers can sometimes get a bad name, and they advertise on TV and billboards way too much. But the reality is this was a case where this young man had no one to fight for him except for us. And my team and I stepped up. We worked as hard as we could for him, and ultimately he got the justice that he deserves. So that's just one of my favorite cases, one of my favorite things that's ever happened in my career. Again, if you like getting these updates, if you like learning more about Georgia law, hearing about interesting cases, please like and subscribe to the podcast. Please, give it a follow. And we'll keep coming out with this information. We'll keep you informed on important legal information that you need to know. And so, thanks for listening today, and we'll see you next time.